Thanks everybody for listening in today. Just our quick disclaimer, this presentation is for educational purposes only. It's not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. We'll have some information at the end on contacting us if you have specific questions. And because your time is valuable and you need to get on with your day after this is done, we'll try to keep things moving along. Now, this might seem like a topic everyone kind of knows about. If you're starting off your working life, you're an employee, you may have gone through or likely have gone through performance reviews, or now if you own a business or you're in management level or supervisor level at a business, you're conducting performance reviews potentially. So people have an overall familiarity with this topic, but what we wanted to do today is to just make you aware of some of the parameters that you want to consider with your performance reviews, and also what are some risks to consider for your business as they relate to performance reviews. So it's somewhat of an overview, but we also want to get into some of the details as well to help you out. So we always like to start with kind of a foundational level piece of information. What is a performance review? Well, it's basically a formal assessment in which a manager evaluates an employee's work performance. It's used to document employee strengths, weaknesses, any areas for improvement. That's sort of the general overview of what you see with a performance review. A performance review is not required by law. It's not for private employers. In the private sector with at-will employees, you're not required to do performance reviews. But evaluating employee performance is generally considered to be a best practice for a business. There are a number of benefits that you, as an employer, can receive from performance evaluation of employees. So potentially, as it notes, it's an opportunity to improve employee work performance with their efficiency and productivity. It can also promote workplace fairness and objectivity. If you're conducting performance evaluations, employees might feel a workplace is more fair and objective when there's a performance review process in place and then that process is followed. It could also potentially help with employee attitudes overall because they would feel more engaged in their work and with the organization if the company is taking an interest in how they're doing, how things are going, what could be better, those sorts of things. So a main purpose of an employee performance review is to assess their individual work performance. An employer can learn actually quite a bit about an employee through a performance review process as you sort of dig into the nuts and bolts of what they're doing and how they're doing it. So you're looking at their actual performance. Are they meeting specific targets? You're looking at employee strengths. Where is this person doing well? You also want to look at what are the employees' weaknesses? Do they lack required skills? Do they maybe need some training in a specific area, or do they need more experience in a specific area? You can look at employee attitude through a performance review. Does the person positively or negatively affect your organization's morale, for example? You can look at professional goals with a performance review. What would the employee like to see for increased success? It also helps you as an employer assess job satisfaction. How does the person actually feel about their job? Assessing individual performance of an employee also gives an employer an opportunity to make decisions about an employee or get information that will help support a future decision of what you want to do as an organization with a particular person. So that could be very positive. Through this review process, you might get information where you want to promote somebody. If you're assessing their performance through a review, it's very useful when you're looking at possibly future promotion. Should the person have an increase in their compensation? That's another area that you can look at when you're evaluating the performance process. Should incentive compensation be used? For example, should this person receive a bonus? They've done a really great job in the last quarter, for example, and as we're reviewing their performance and evaluating it, would a bonus be useful for this person? The flip side of that, if maybe an employee is not doing very well, a performance review can be an opportunity to look at whether a performance improvement plan is needed to help bring the person up to speed. And then also it can be used to see if an adverse employment action needs to be taken. Does the person need to be counseled? Do they need to be disciplined, written up? Do they need to be demoted? Do they need to be terminated? So performance reviews are useful for both the positive and the negative assessment of workers. We were just talking about the performance review functions for each individual employee, but what about using performance reviews to broadly look at employees within your organization? A performance review, or the data you take in from your performance reviews, can be used to compare employee groups and job categories on sort of a wider basis. You want to absolutely look at the individual performance, strengths, weaknesses, things like that, but you can then take all that information from the employee performance reviews and synthesize that into group evaluation of the organization. So you can see who is the group of the best employees, those with superior quality of work. They meet their production goals, they work well with others, et cetera. That could be spread across several different teams of individuals, but it would help you show who the highest performing group within the overall organization is. Flip side of that, you could see who the underperforming employees are, or if there's maybe within a work group a larger amount of underperforming employees. That would help you assess what maybe needs to be done with a department, for example, if that happened to be the case. It can help when you're looking at all of the performance review information for employees, figure out areas of focus for training or recruiting. If you are seeing, again, people who are weak in a specific department in certain skills, there could be targeted training to help that work group get better at what they're doing. There could also, that information could also be used to adjust your recruiting on the front side. So making sure anybody going into that department ahead of time has the skills they need, so that you're not having to suss that out later. You can also look at your manager and supervisor abilities through the overall performance review process. You can measure the direct reports against a particularly high or low standard of performance to see how their manager or supervisor is doing. So you could have a manager who's got an exceptional team. You could have a manager who's got a maybe less exceptional team. Looking at that overall group of performance review information for all employees can help you assess those critical people in your organization at the supervisory and managerial level as well. You could also see if there are issues within a team, if maybe there's an issue due to a morale problem based on maybe something a manager or supervisor is doing. It's just another way to help you use all of the information to assess the organization, at the individual employee level for sure, as we just discussed, but also then taking all that data and applying it across different groups. Another benefit of doing performance reviews is that it can increase your organizational efficiency. You want to look at the data again that you're taking out of these performance reviews to see if you can improve the organization's efficiency and productivity. So again, you want to look at your overperforming employees, and that doesn't mean just the people who are doing well. We're talking about figuring out who goes above and beyond. So who are your real stars? That's a way that you can use that data to increase your efficiency within your company. Also, as discussed, identify the underperforming employees who really need some help. That's a way to utilize this data that you're receiving. Also, it's a way to discover employee retention factors. Through the performance evaluation process, an employer can figure out what is it about your company or your culture that people like. Is it pay structure? Is it a good work-life balance? Is it employee benefits? Using the performance review information can help you in that critical area of employee retention, because it's sometimes not easy to find a good worker. And once you do find a good worker, you probably don't want to lose them. So looking at retention factors from this performance review data for the organization can be very, very useful. It also gives you the opportunity in terms of efficiency to see, hey, who is ready to be promoted? Who can be brought up to the next level? That will not only help them, but it will help our organization because this person is doing very well. Also, even beyond a promotion, you could look at further overall organizational leadership candidates through this process. You can see who, again, the people are who are the stars, who are able to rise up within the organization, keeping things where you're not having to look for outside people or potentially losing somebody. You could bring somebody up from within. We talked about some of the benefits of performance reviews for your organization overall, but we also want to talk about on the employee side. So what benefits do the employees get out of the performance review or performance evaluation process? It definitely can give them awareness of their needs for improvement. For some employees, performance reviews are the only feedback, either positive or negative, that they receive on their job performance and opportunities for advancement. So it can be a useful tool. We're going to talk more about a little bit down the road here about how you can expand your information on performance to employees. But if people are only doing a performance review maybe once a year, it is an opportunity to give an employee the awareness of their need for improvement. As we discussed earlier too, a performance review can help employees feel more engaged with the companies that they're working for. So if an employee receives specific and thorough feedback, they're probably more likely to look at making improvements that are requested by their employer, because that process has made them feel probably more engaged with their work. Maybe they feel more valued because the employer is like, hey, if you can do this better, it's going to be better for you. It's going to be better for everybody. And then they also feel like they're connected to the operation. They're not just a distant, drone-like worker doing something where they're not having any interaction or feedback. The feedback through the performance review process can help them feel like they are connected to your business. But if you've got employees who are not aware of their performance level, or they don't know your company's expectations because they haven't received specific feedback on what the issues are, they are probably going to be less likely to meet expectations. So again, employees can benefit through this process if the company is giving them useful feedback so they know what they can improve on. We do want to talk about performance reviews. We mentioned this at the beginning, how yes, they are a useful tool, but they are also processes that can create risk for an employer if you're not aware of certain specific areas that could crop up through the performance review process. There are just a couple of subjects that we want to talk about where with your performance reviews as an employer, you want to be very careful. Just to provide some background, unsatisfactory performance is one of the most common reasons that employers get rid of their employees. I mean, that makes sense. So the employer says, hey, you've had some issues, performance issues, policy violations. We're not going to keep you. So if an employee's not doing their job and they're let go, that unsatisfactory performance is one of the main reasons. Because of that, the performance review documentation that's generated, if the company's using a performance review form, they write all the information down. If somebody's discharged by the company and they don't like that, your performance review documentation is going to become evidence in some type of claim, whether that's from a state or federal agency, or whether it's from the former employee hiring a private plaintiff's attorney. Your performance review documentation is going to be evidence to show what the company wrote down about the employee's performance. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it satisfactory? Unsatisfactory? Performance reviews do become central in many employment discrimination and retaliation cases. because a lot of times they're an employer's only written communication with the employee about their job performance. It's going to potentially end up in a performance review document. And even when an unsatisfactory performance issue is the stated reason for an employee's termination, if that performance review documentation comes out, sometimes the employee's performance reviews don't adequately reflect that the employee was actually having performance shortcomings. So it's very critical that when you are completing performance review documentation, that it's accurate. And we'll talk a little bit more about that down the road here. But it's very important that what gets written down ties into what your actual reasons are if you're going to take an adverse action, because that's going to help you reduce your risk for discrimination or retaliation claim by an employee who is let go for poor performance, but then maybe the performance review documentation doesn't support it. So, for example, maybe an employer has noted times the employee violated rules, but the most recent performance evaluation that comes out in some sort of claim situation says something like, oh, the employee's good or meets expectations. A positive or neutral performance review document compared against the employee being told, hey, you're doing a bad job. If they turn around and say, well, you fired me. No, I wasn't doing a bad job. Look at this document that you've produced in this litigation. It says I'm good or there's no issue. That's gonna be where problems are gonna come in for your company. So one of the bullet points here is talking about pretext. We do want to talk about that in the litigation risk context. So pretext is a reason given as a justification for taking action that is not the real reason. So pretext means the employer is saying something that's not true in terms of why someone was let go, things along those lines. So employees who feel they've been treated unfairly often argue that the employer's reason for taking the adverse employment action, so if they were demoted, if they were fired, against the employee is false, and that it's a pretext, again, an untrue reason for the employee being discriminated against, for example. For example, employees may attack performance reviews as not true or a cover-up for the real reason was someone was demoted or let go. The employee could say something like, performance review said I wasn't meeting standards, but I know the real reason is because of my protected class status. That's where pretext can come into play. So if the employer claims that it took an adverse employment action against an employee for a legitimate, non-discriminatory business reason of, say, something like poor performance, then you want to make sure that you've got documentation that supports that. If your documentation from a performance review doesn't note some of those issues, that can come back to bite you down the road. So in a litigation setting, say you're in court in a claim, a judge or a jury can easily make the leap in their minds to say that the employer's stated reason we let somebody go, oh, the person was, a poor performer, they didn't meet standards, could be seen as a pretext if you don't have, say, for example, performance review documentation backing that up. So we want to talk about that very important topic of avoiding pretext. So a way to keep that at risk more at bay is to have good detail of legitimate, non-discriminatory, non-retaliatory business reasons documented in your performance review or other discipline documents. If you are taking an adverse action with somebody, you want to have documentation that backs it up. Similarly, you've got to be careful with performance review documentation that are too subjective. So if something happens where an employee is let go, they come back later, they want to make a discrimination claim or retaliation claim, saying my termination was unlawful, you've got to look within the organization then with people who are actually conducting the performance reviews. You don't want to have an inconsistent application of standards within your performance review process. For example, if manager ABC is the easy manager who gives the good quote unquote performance reviews, you don't want to turn around and then have manager XYZ who's the tougher performance reviewer, who is more subjective with their criteria, where they're nicking people on little things, versus manager ABC who's more easygoing. within the organization, you want control and consistency with the people that are actually conducting the performance evaluations to make sure that it is applied equally across the board. A showing of subjectivity, well, I was reviewed by manager ABC last year and it went great, but I was reviewed by manager XYZ this year and it went terribly, even though everything was the same. That's going to hurt you with subjectivity. So those are just a couple of risks with your performance review process, your documentation, and if litigation unfortunately were to occur. So for employers, what are some best practices for performance reviews? We just sort of touched on this at the end of the last slide, but it's worth repeating. You want to have whoever is conducting your performance evaluations, whether you're a small, medium, or large organization, you want to have those individuals trained. It's difficult with conducting performance reviews to make sure that the important factor of fairness and well executed performance reviews, you've got to hit that standard. You want to make sure that whoever is doing your evaluations are trained on how to properly do the performance reviews and how to miss some of the issues that we were just talking about that create risk. So with the training, you want to make sure to emphasize that the performance reviews need to be objective, they need to be clear, they need to be accurate, they need to be timely. The training should also look at ways that the person conducting the evaluations can convey to the individual or individuals being reviewed your expectations as an employer, how to handle if you've got to give bad news to somebody, and then how the person conducting the performance evaluation can answer common questions about things like compensation and opportunities for advancement. It's also very important that the training of whoever is going to conduct your performance reviews avoid consideration of prohibited factors like an employee's sex, age, race, national origin, religion, disability status, or membership in any other protected class. So you want to assess your performance evaluation, making sure that you've got neutral factors that are not discriminatory, in addition to making sure that your evaluators are being objective, clear, and accurate with what they're talking about. The second factor that you want to look at to conduct successful performance reviews is to assess employee performance using specific criteria. So the review should be objective overall, but within a specific job itself or job category, they need to reflect what's required for that job. So you want to make sure that the review covers that job title or broad categories of employees. You want to make sure those factors are in there. You want to look at particular job duties and responsibilities. You should think about an employee's achievement or lack of achievement of specified targets and goals, such as the ability to take instruction from their supervisors, their ability to communicate and work effectively with coworkers, whether the employee shows initiative, what is the person's attitude in the workplace. Usually those reviews are best done when somebody actually knows the individual who's being reviewed and evaluated, so they know the person's strengths, weaknesses, attitudes, and goals kind of to start with. The review should also look at each aspect of the employee's performance independently. Don't just focus on one area, look at all aspects of it. You also want to make sure that when you are preparing the criteria to look at for an employee performance evaluation, that you're not having something within your employee performance review process that conflicts with your policies or goes against, if you've got a unionized workforce, a collective bargaining agreement requirement. You want to make sure that you are fair, consistent, and balanced for your full workforce, but also taking again into account before you're going to ding somebody on a performance issue, for example, that what you're talking about isn't in violation of your own company's policies, or is it violating, say, a collective bargaining agreement requirement if you have any unionized people within your workforce. The third factor that you want to consider as a best practice with performance evaluations is being straightforward and honest in the communications with the employees being evaluated. That is the best way, if you're straightforward and honest, that you can convey information to them on what they need to improve. It might be easier to avoid discussing someone's underperformance. It can be uncomfortable on a person-to-person basis. Everybody knows that. But providing constructive criticism can be useful. It can help the person get better so they can keep their job, but it also can help your organization keep people. You want to make sure that you're clearly communicating how someone can improve their performance. Also, if the person needs a warning, that has to be clearly communicated. So being straightforward and honest is a way to not only benefit the employee to improve if they need to, benefit your organization when the employee improves, but it also protects liability creation for your business because you're lessening that risk by communicating honestly. You want to be as detailed as possible within an individual performance review. I mean, it is understood that it can be difficult and time consuming when you're doing a detailed performance review, but an overly vague performance review is not going to benefit your organization. For the people that conduct performance reviews within your organization, you want to make sure that they've got adequate time to do that. That's important so it doesn't feel rushed. During the process of the review itself, the reviewer should be giving the employee detailed examples of what they're doing well, and if there are areas that need to be improved, how they can be improved. There should be details given about poor performance or underperformance. When the discussions are taking place with the employee, it's important to be non-confrontational, focus on documented performance problems, be open to receiving comments, and then have the reviewer thinking ahead about ways to suggest for the person to improve the issue. Don't just dump the issue on them. Think about a way to collaboratively within the process tell the person these might be some ways to get better. It also can be useful at the end of the review if the reviewer gives the employee some clear and concise information on their expectations, their goals going forward, what are the strategies to meet those goals, as we mentioned, the timeframes, and if there are going to be consequences for not meeting those goals. It's also important for your reviewers to avoid inappropriate topics, such as if somebody was gone on job protected FMLA leave, that should not be brought up in a performance review, or if someone wears specific clothing or an item of clothing such as headgear related to a religious belief, that should not be brought up. That, you know, hey, your religious attire is distracting in the workplace. That's not something that should be brought up in a performance review. Another best practice is to take employee feedback into account. We mentioned before setting up adequate time for the performance review so that it's not just the manager talking at the employee being reviewed. There could be a discussion. So you want to have time for the reviewer to be able to listen to the employee's comments and concerns and to provide some feedback as the process goes forward. If the employee does offer comments, generally a best practice is to note them on the performance review itself. That gives a record then that, you know, John spoke up and said this during the review. At the end of the review, then the reviewer and the person can sign off on the noted annotation to make sure everybody's on the same page. If the employee would refuse to sign the notes, for example, then the reviewer could just make a note that the person, you know, refused to sign. Another hugely important best practice for when an employer is conducting performance reviews is to avoid emotional, sarcastic, or unnecessary language. A performance review can be stressful for both people on the management side, the person giving the review, and then on the labor side, the person receiving the review. It's best to have your reviewers be very neutral and non-emotional with anything that they are saying during the review process. It's also understood that sometimes a reviewer who's feeling uncomfortable with the process of reviewing the employee might find it easier to just resort to making a little sarcastic comment or humor or a little joke when discussing the review, especially if they're talking about a weaker aspect of the employee's performance. But That could create issues because then maybe the seriousness of the information is not being fully conveyed, or the employee, when they receive that kind of jokey information, they're not taking it seriously where they would actually know they need to improve. It's best if the employer then avoids sarcasm, jokes, or inappropriate humor. They're better off focusing on assessment of performance, and staying away from emotional or sarcastic language also helps avoid misunderstandings or miscommunications with the employee. If you're joking around, or the reviewer and the employee are joking around through the whole review, and then the employee later gets fired or something like that, they would say, well, hey, this was never apparent to me because we were just laughing through the whole thing. That's not good. Another area for your reviewers to avoid is to ad lib or branch off into tangents. Again, you want to keep focused on what's going well, what could be done to improve, what's not going well, what could be done to improve, those sorts of things. That's the best thing. And also make sure that your reviewers understand that the company information needs to be kept confidential, as well as the review information itself following the review, that needs to be confidential as well. Another best practice for your performance reviews is to be timely with those reviews. If you have a performance review schedule, you do want to keep that schedule. So many employers perform performance reviews quarterly, maybe twice yearly, or maybe annually. If you have written policies that state performance reviews are conducted on a specific schedule, make sure that you keep to that schedule. If you have published the schedule and then you don't follow it, conducting the reviews late can lead to upset employees. And if you got in a dispute down the road with a state agency, or again, a private plaintiff's attorney was involved over something, that can come back to bite you. It shows also to those decision makers in some sort of proceeding that the company was not serious about their performance review process. So a lot of employers do one sit down formal performance review each year, but in our experience, more and more employers are now conducting up to two. I mean, we mentioned quarterly and some do quarterly, but some are doing up to two a year. So one at the beginning of the calendar or fiscal year, and one at the midpoint of that year. So let's talk about the mid-year performance review. What are some of the benefits? As discussed, a more frequent feedback leads to less surprises for the employee. That can help lower anxiety. That can help lower resentment or anger if somebody gets a negative review. If you're going through the process in a more organized fashion on a regular schedule, that is less surprises for employees. It also provides an opportunity for the company to have more documentation of their performance, whether that's good, whether that's bad. It communicates to the employees their opportunities for improvement. And all of those factors taken together can help reduce risk for your company. So let's talk about performance management overall. One aspect of performance management is the performance review process, as we've been discussing today. But maybe we even want to take a step back from that and look at overall performance management. Reviewing an employee's performance should not occur just once or twice a year in a very formal setting. Instead, employers should be constantly evaluating an employee's work. So that can be done basically informally on even a daily basis. If you are doing that, if you are consciously monitoring performance and then informally checking in with an employee if you see something good or if you see something bad, that can help the employee correct issues more quickly. That means also fewer surprises for an employee. Again, the example, if there's one formal performance review a year and they haven't heard anything about a problem that's been lingering for 9 months, and suddenly it's sprung on them in the one single annual performance review, people might get angry. They might take an adverse action against your company if they don't like something. But that informal sort of performance management helps avoid that. It could be a verbal correction, it could be verbal praise, but just keeping an eye on that even on a daily basis can be very useful. An employer can't necessarily constantly evaluate um, every employee's work, but that can be an aspirational goal to try to do that as much as you can within your organization. That will depend on the number of employees, obviously, the number of supervisors, things along those lines. But to the extent you can informally observe and praise or correct where needed what somebody's doing, that's going to help your overall organization function better. Let's talk about some performance review pitfalls to avoid. We briefly touched on some of these factors before, but we want to emphasize them because this is the area where employers get into trouble. So it's worth mentioning again within this presentation to keep these areas of potential risk in mind as you are doing either specific formal performance reviews or even into the informal correction or praise of employees. Just keep some of these ideas in mind. So avoid subjectivity. We talked about that. Performance reviews and performance evaluation overall should use objective criteria, not subjective criteria. So for example, if you've got sales representatives within your business, they should be evaluated based on achieving specific sales goals, for example, instead of asking the reviewer to indicate whether the person are they effective overall, are they ineffective overall? That's not a good way to look at it. Instead, it's better to have that criteria in place of goals that everybody within the category, are they meeting them, are they not meeting them, versus the vague subject of effective or ineffective. It's also important to, let's go back one, please. It's also important to avoid ambiguity. The reviews need to be clear and specific. If there are ambiguous statements or just broad blank statements that are less specific on issues, that's more likely to confuse the employee. Their expectations aren't clear. Do I need to do better? What's happening? Also, ambiguous statements within a performance review. If you ever find yourself in an adversarial situation with a government or an outside attorney, adversarial proceeding or situation, if the documentation from your performance reviews are ambiguous, the employee's attorney or the judge or whoever's involved is going to be able to say, well, how could you hold them to that standard? This document doesn't say what specifically they need to do to improve, so we think you lose on that argument. You want to avoid inaccuracy within your performance reviews. You want to not soft pedal information within a performance review document because you're trying not to hurt somebody's feelings. You want to instead put them on notice. If somebody does need to improve, you want to have that specific information available to them so they can actually try to improve. And that also will help you as well down the road if you do need to take an adverse action. If you said something specific, such as this metric needs to be improved within 3 months and the person didn't do it, that's going to help you. And then also avoid being off schedule, as we mentioned. Don't set a schedule and then not follow it. That gives employees reason to be mad. It lowers morale, and it reflects poorly on your organization if you get into some sort of conflict with somebody down the road. So how can we help you with performance reviews specifically and with overall performance management of employees overall? So talk to us. We're very familiar with performance reviews and performance management. That's something we deal with daily in our jobs here. If you're a subscriber to our weekly newsletter, make sure you're reading that. It comes out on Tuesday mornings. It provides updates on all kinds of employment law related topics. And also we'll touch on this specific subject when there's news of note relating to it. And then we can also advise you on the best way to approach performance evaluations to reduce risk. We've given you some broad information today, but if you're one of our clients and you've got specific information that you're wondering about, or your review cycle is coming up and you've got questions, let us know. We can help you evaluate your risk and guide you in the proper directions if needed. We've got the answers you can rely on, and remember, compliance is not optional.